Hi, I'm Rachel with Rachel Ray's Crime Corner. And I'm back with another interesting story. I found it very interesting. I had never heard of it before. As I was researching the Matthew Ward story, I came upon this article in a newspaper from 1878. I couldn't find any other information on it. It's about a girl who went missing in 1846. So grab a snack, take a walk, cook supper, do the dishes. Those are things I like to do when I'm listening to my true crimes or podcasts. And let's take a journey to the 1800s. A man named Asahel Ward came from Cattaraugus, New York to Butler County, Pennsylvania in 1818. He built a log home, made a little clearing, and planted an orchard. He got a patent from the state authorities and married Mary Irvin, the daughter of a neighboring settler. They had 10 children together, but only 7 lived. The father had his hands full putting food on the table, and his wife Mary was very busy trying to raise their brood. The little log house had one room that was 18 by 24 feet. The family slept and ate in this room. There was a bed in each corner. The sun served as their clock, and the fireplace was their stove. Asahel and Mary's eldest daughter Emily was a beautiful young lady with olive complexion, dark brown eyes, and hair. She was of medium height, slender, very neat, and ladylike. Emily and her siblings attended school in a little stone house nearby. Her cousin had just married a man named Harrison, and Emily would often visit them. Once in February, while she was visiting with them, Harrison cut a strange figure out of brown paper. He threw it into Emily's lap. As he did, he said, "There's a valentine for you, Emily." She put it into her pocketbook and showed it to her mom and sisters when she returned home. Emily often visited her maternal grandparents who lived nearby and would stay for weeks at a time. When she was 16, her grandmother passed away, and Emily took charge of the house. A month later, her grandfather was found dead in a coal bank. An inquest was held by the magistrate, John Campbell. He removed the furniture from Emily's grandparents' home and put it into the schoolhouse. He resided in the schoolhouse for some time while his own residence was being repaired. At one point, his wife became very ill. Emily moved in with her temporarily and nursed her back to health. Philip Sanderson, the son of a nearby farmer, took an interest in 18-year-old Emily. Her parents did not like him and objected to the match. Young Emily, however, was extremely infatuated with him, so her mom decided to send her to her grandmother Ward's home in Salamanca, New York, which was about 150 miles from Butler County. Emily's uncle, Sheldon Ward, and Emily left the Ward farm on horseback in August of 1846. The two stayed the night in Brady's Bend with Emily's cousin and husband, Harrison, the man who had made the Valentine. From there, they took the stage and left the horses with Harrison to return to the Ward's farm. Asahel Ward never saw his daughter Emily or his brother again. He never received any letters from his mother, and it does not appear that he made any inquiries into the whereabouts of Emily or his brother Sheldon. A few years later, Asahel learned in a roundabout way that his mom had passed away. He received no further information, and he felt his daughter was old enough to write or find her way home if she needed any help. Asahel died 13 years later. His children divided up their father's property amicably, and they even left an equal share in the middle of the farm for their sister Emily. Emily's sisters, Ellen and Nancy, married brothers by the name of Stillwagon, and her sister Amanda married a farmer by the name of Hoover. Harvey, Curtis, Ramsey, and George. Those were her brothers. They all got married and they settled on their shares of the farm. George took the name of George W. because there was another George Ward that lived close by, and there had been some confusion in the post office over their letters. George W.'s wife had been married before. Eventually, there was a strong disagreement between George and his brothers, and they were not able to resolve the issue. The Ward children worked hard and never accumulated much wealth. But soon that all changed. In 1867, petroleum was discovered in Butler County. The Ward farm lay in the heart of the oil region. The brothers and sisters sold and leased their land to speculators at moderate prices. Derricks were erected and wells bored. A vast fortune oozed from the ground. More than 250,000 barrels of oil, valued at over $500,000, were pumped from the farm. Emily's share was unclaimed, so a shrewd speculator named Hartman put down a well on his own account. His greed did not serve him well because his $4,000 derrick was the only one produced absolutely no oil. In 1877, George W.'s wife received a letter from her mom, who lived 70 miles away in Meadville, Pennsylvania. She said that she had become acquainted with a lady by the name of Emily Ward, and the lady mentioned that she was a relative of the Ward family from Butler County. George's mother-in-law came to Butler County to visit her daughter, and as she talked about the lady who claimed to be Emily, her story was so convincing, George decided he wanted to go see her and find out if she was his long-lost sister. When he arrived in Meadville and found the girl, he discovered that she was married to an R.E. Danforth. Interestingly, R.E. Danforth was the ex-husband of George W.'s current wife. The man looked to be about 37 years old, but the woman looked like she was around 60. She had gray hair, no teeth, mournful eyes, sunken cheeks, and a haggard face that outlined a life of woe and misery. Before his second marriage, Danforth had spent some time in an asylum. George began to talk with Mrs. Danforth. They talked for over an hour, but he never told her who he was. He told her he had just come out of the oil regions and was in Meadville on business. She asked him if he knew the Wards from Butler County. He said he had heard of them. Weren't they that family who had a daughter mysteriously disappear about 25 years earlier? She eagerly answered, yes. It was actually over 30 years ago. Her prompt reply surprised George, but he controlled his feelings. He said, if the girl should ever show up alive, there would be something left for her. She replied, why, I thought the place was gone a long time ago. The next day, George paid another visit. She told him that his first visit had weighed heavy on her mind and caused her to have a restless night. Ain't you George W. Ward? The girl inquired, without removing her gaze from his face. There's one kind of interesting thing here. He was never called George W. Ward until long after Emily had disappeared. In the family Bible that they had, his name was George Ward, not George W. Ward, but she called him George W. Ward. He could no longer contain himself. Yes, that is my name. They then sat down and she told him many incidents from his boyish life. He was only 10 when Emily disappeared from home. Her reminiscences were so accurate, he felt convinced she was his long-lost sister. Around May of 1878, there was a trial. In order to determine the status of Emily's property, They needed to decide whether or not the girl was indeed Emily Ward. This is the sad story that the girl told of her life after leaving the family farm with her uncle Sheldon. She said her name was Emily Danvers. She said she left home when the apples were ripening. She had ridden a whitish horse, and her uncle had ridden a sorrel horse. They had stopped by her cousin Harrison's house and lodged there overnight. It was 11 the next morning when they headed on their way. They traveled in a two horseback until it was evening and slept in a log house near a running brook. Her uncle did not tell her whose house it was, nor did he tell her the names of the towns they had passed through. Sometime during the third day, they arrived at her grandmother's house. The old lady was pleased to see her and gave her a kiss on the cheek. After a week, she turned in to do housework and take care of her grandmother, who was growing feeble. Her uncle remained in the neighborhood and she saw him frequently. After only 18 months, her dear grandmother had died, and her uncle had determined to take her back to Butler County. After traveling all day, they stopped at the house of a man by the name of George Hill at the mouth of Sawmill Run on the Allegheny River. The country was wild and uncultivated. She was put into her own room and she slept soundly all night. In the morning, when she got up, she could not find her uncle anywhere. He had disappeared, and she had no reason to believe he had passed the night in the Hills' house. The treatment she later received led her to believe that her uncle had been murdered. She was stripped of her clothes and left in a room under guard for over 2 months. They treated her very cruelly. She was whipped and abused in many ways by Mrs. Hill. They told her that her uncle had willingly left and told her that she was their daughter, Mahala. Their daughter was a girl of bad repute and had been missing for some time. After 7 months, she was forced to marry a man she had never even spoken to and had just met the day before. He was a shingle maker by the name of John Gray. They were married by a man named Mr. Hathaway, who claimed to be a justice of the peace. She said it was on a Sunday, and a magistrate could not legally perform a marriage ceremony on a Sunday in Pennsylvania. The Hills were the only witnesses. They had boarded with the Hills for 2 months and then left for Bucyrus, Ohio. Not sure exactly how to say that. There he worked odd jobs and whatever he could find to do. She did not have any better with him than she had with the Hills. He spent his wages on rum and treated her terribly. Her first son was born in Bucyrus, and she gave him the singular name of Owl. She couldn't remember the year he was born, but knew if he was alive at the time of the trial, he'd be 30 years old. They moved frequently and later had twin boys. She named them Wilhelm and Curtis Rue. Curtis Rue was named after her brother, Curtis Rumsey, but she shortened it to Rue because Rumsey was too suggestive of rum, the cause of her sufferings by her husband. They finally settled for 6 years in Wattsburg, Pennsylvania. She said her husband became more brutal and treated her like a slave. During their sad journey, she bore 9 children. Finally, after a few more years of complete misery, her husband deserted her and she never saw him again. She returned to Wattsburg, Pennsylvania, and was there 2 months when she received a letter from her son, Owl. His wife had died. He needed help taking care of his child while he ran a sawmill. A few years later, Al and his child died. In 1859, the court had granted her a divorce from John Gray on the grounds of desertion. She moved to Meadville, Pennsylvania, and lodged in the home of a tailor and widower by the name of George Dixon. Her home was a room on the upper floor without a door or connection to the room below. Dixon built a stairway outside of the building, and she used to crawl through one of the windows. She did her cooking in the tailor shop, which was also Dixon's bedroom. During the war, 3 of her sons entered the army. all three had died. While living with Dixon, Calvin Hill, a brother of George, called on her and claimed to be her uncle. He was accompanied by a Mrs. Cranker and a Mrs. Marks, daughters of George Hill, who said they were her sisters. She dismissed all three and would not permit them to stay overnight. Around 1873, she married a man by the name of Danforth, and they moved to a farm near Meadville, and that's where she was living when George Ward found her. George wanted Emily to make a conveyance of her share of the property to him. He went to a leading lawyer and judge, but he was told since he participated in the original division of the property, he would not be able to get a conveyance. He found a lawyer by the name of G.S. Crosby and began to share this story with him. He told him he believed he had found his long lost sister. He said she was too poor to go into litigation and recover her share of the property. If someone would pay the expense of the suit, he was sure she would do the right thing. Crosby said he'd provide the $500 and take a chance on her. If he was able to recover the property, Emily would get more. George got the conveyance from her and gave it to Crosby. Crosby went to visit with Emily, and he was convinced she was not an impostor. She spoke without hesitation and answered every question satisfactorily. During the trial, Crosby mentioned there was no arrangement with George and that he would receive nothing, no matter what the outcome of the trial was. Crosby found out that Emily had an old aunt who resided in Oil City. When Emily was a child, her aunt regarded her as a favorite niece. Crosby paid the expenses for George Ward and Frank Gray, a lawyer on the case, to accompany Mrs. Danforth to Oil City and see if the aunt would recognize her. The aunt knew her in an instant. She gave her address and was positive this was the lost Emily. Danforth visited her 2 or 3 more times during the summer before the trial, and each time she was affectionately received. Emily's brother, Curtis Rumsey, was the first of the siblings to go to Meadville to see Mrs. Danforth after George told his siblings about her. She said he did not recognize her, but she recognized him and asked him if he was Kurt Ward, and he answered her that he was. Curtis, however, said that she asked him his name, and he told her it was Rumsey. He denied acknowledging his real name to her. He gave her $5 for her and her husband to visit the old homestead. He told them to get off the train at Monterey, Pennsylvania. He said if he wasn't there to meet them, his brother Harvey would meet them. She said that she, her husband, and lawyer Frank Ray did exactly that, so she could be identified by her mother, brothers, and sisters. They departed the Allegheny Railroad, and as they were getting on the ferry boat to cross the Allegheny River, she saw her older brother Harvey in the company of some other men. She recognized him and called him by name, but he told her she was mistaken. Harvey testified that never happened, and she did not call his name. Danforth's husband and Frank Ray both confirmed her statement. On their trip, they stopped first at Curtis Rumsey's house, where they met the mother of the lost Emily. Danforth said that her mother recognized her, but did not say whether the mother kissed her or displayed the affection that one would expect under these circumstances. After supper, she went to Harvey's house and was warmly received by him. The scene at the ferry was not mentioned at that time. She spent some time visiting with Curtis and Harvey, whose homes were side by side, and later she went to the old homestead. Ellen and Nancy Stillwagon, sisters of the lost Emily, came to see Mrs. Danforth. When they entered the room, Ellen was holding Nancy's child. Ellen was a widow. Danforth said she knew who Ellen was as soon as she saw her, even though she was holding Nancy's child, and she called both sisters by their correct names. The sisters denied this. and said that she was misled by the child, causing her to get their names mixed up. When the brothers and sisters heard that Danforth had conveyed her claim to Crosby, they advised her to take steps to secure the property and break the conveyance. They offered to help her, and they went with her to Butler to speak with a tough congressman by the name of John Thompson. There was a senator, John Greer, present the day they visited with Thompson. He said the Ward party introduced Mrs. Danforth as their long lost sister, Emily, and said that she had been terribly abused. Harvey mentioned that if John Gray, the abusive man Emily was forced to marry, was there, he'd make it hot for him. Thompson tried to help them, but he discovered the conveyance to Crosby was already on record, and they were too late to reverse it. The Wards then asked Danforth to make a criminal charge against George W. Ward and G. W. Crosby for conspiracy in fraudulently getting her to sign the deed. She refused to do that. The facts concerning this scene in Thompson's office were not brought into the trial because the congressman was in Washington attending to duties there. Senator Greer was taking care of business in Harrisburg. After this, they went back to Curtis Ward's home. While they were on their way back, she said she pointed out Squire James Campbell's place and the old stone schoolhouse. She also pointed out Grandfather Irvin's residence and the home of a neighbor by the name of Mr. Shockley. The next day, they went to Amanda Hoover's house, the other sister of the Wards. Amanda kissed her and called her Emily. Ellen and Nancy accompanied her as they went back to their home. Before parting ways, Ellen gave Danforth a handkerchief, and Nancy gave her a pair of stockings. They affectionately embraced and kissed the girl before she left. The mother gave her a small present, and Curtis gave her a pair of gloves. All of them invited her to come visit them again. She went back to Meadville with her husband. She received a letter from Amanda, who referred to her as "dear sister." Amanda's children also wrote to her, addressing her as "dear aunt." These letters told her not to fret. They had no intentions of disowning her, and they planned to see that she was treated fairly. These letters were produced in court, which brought about a profound sensation. On New Year's Day, she visited Nancy and Ellen at Centerville and was cordially received. She stayed there for a couple of days. While there, Ellen brought a rolled up handkerchief out to show Danforth. As she unrolled it, Danforth saw it contained brown paper that had been cut into fantastic shapes. Ellen asked her if she knew what it was. She said, "This was given to me by William Harrison when I was a girl." This was the valentine the husband of Emily's cousin had given to her. In court, Ellen denied this, saying that she showed it to Mrs. Danforth, saying, "Here's something that Emily left at home." She said Mrs. Danforth took it and kept it against Ellen's will. The paper was shown to the court. Mrs. Danforth said when she left Centerville, the two girls embraced her, and they parted, as sisters should. Afterward, she was escorted to Oil City by Mr. Ray, who told her she was going to meet one of her old neighbors. As she got out of the car, she saw Squire Campbell in a crowd and called him by name. Squire Campbell and Frank Ray both corroborated her story. She returned to Meadville and did not return until she was summoned as a witness. Philip Sanderson, the boy who had warranted the concern of Emily's parents, appeared before the court. At this point, he was a tall, slender, gray-haired man with a bushy white beard. He sorrowfully looked at the careworn face of the claimant and testified that he believed her. He said he was convinced she was the real and genuine Emily. Squire James Campbell was next on the stand. He would not positively swear that Mrs. Danforth was the lost girl, but he thought she was. Fletcher Irvin was a cousin of Emily. He thought Mrs. Danforth was the genuine Emily, but he wouldn't swear to it. He was questioned concerning the color and texture of the lost Emily's hair. Mrs. Danforth was asked to remove her bonnet. She did so, and the old man drew a pair of antique spectacles over his nose. He felt the long gray hair and black locks, saying, "That looks like Emily's hair." Neil Pease, a 79-year-old farmer, testified that Dixon, with whom Mrs. Danforth lived before her second marriage, was his tailor. 7 years earlier, he went into the shop and heard a bitter quarrel between Danforth and Dixon. In the heat of the quarrel, Dixon asserted that Danforth was George Hill's daughter, Mahala. She indignantly denied it, saying, "No, my name is Emma Ward. I don't claim connection with a family who's committed murder." She afterward told the witness that her maiden name was Emily Ward. Crosby had gone to Oil City to try to get Emily's aunt to testify, but the lady refused. Mrs. Danforth said she had not reached out to her relatives because she wasn't aware there was any property left. Her shameful relations to Dixon also stood in the way. A lawyer by the name of N.E. Smiley cross-examined Danforth. He began by asking about her life after leaving home and asked her to describe the old homestead. She remembered the color of the horse she had ridden on the day she left, the lunch at her cousin's, and the two horseback they had ridden the second day. But the scenes of her childhood were wiped from her mind. She could not tell whether there was a front yard to the house, had forgotten all about the old poplar tree, and had no recollection of their old dog, Trim, who had been with the family for 12 years when Emily went missing. Cows, horses, cats, and chickens had passed beyond her memory. She didn't even remember that her grandfather was found dead in a coal bank a month after her grandmother's death, even though she had lived with them for a year and both had died before she disappeared. She didn't remember that Squire Campbell had held an inquest into the death of her grandfather. She remembered joining the Methodist church, but couldn't tell where it was located. She remembered the stone schoolhouse, but said it stood on her father's farm. She swore there were two rooms in her father's house and that she slept in the garret. She spoke of an old clock that was wound up by pulling the weights, but there was no evidence that Azazel ever owned a clock. She said that her lack of memory was due to the brutal treatment she had received from her first husband. He had arrested her mind and driven all the happy scenes of her girlhood from her recollection. Mr. Smiley then questioned her concerning the birth of her children. She swore that Al was born within 2 years after she left home in 1846, and that he was her eldest son. She was certain he was a widower, a father, and a boss at a sawmill in Centerville. Her other three sons, William, Curtis Rue, and Pearl D., were in the Army. The cross-examination continued. Mr. Smiley asked, how old was Al when he was a widower, a father, and a boss of a sawmill? Danforth said, "Oh, he was very young, a mere child, very young indeed when he was married. A mere child was Al when he got a wife. He was very young indeed." Mr. Smiley said, "That will do, Mrs. Danforth. Al must have been very young indeed." At this point, the courtroom rang with laughter. Everyone could see that, according to her evidence, Al was a widower, father, and boss of a sawmill before the age of 12. Mr. Smiley asked, "How old were the younger boys when they went into the army?" Mrs. Danforth, "Oh, they went out to cook for the captain. The captain wanted them to cook for him, and they went out with him to cook for—" Mr. Smiley said, "That will do, Mrs. Danforth. Don't repeat it. We've got it all." The descriptive list of the regiment in which the twins were enlisted would have told their ages, but the defense made no effort to secure it. On cross-examination, she reluctantly admitted that in company with Dixon she once visited one of George Hill's daughters, Mrs. Cranker, living near Salamanca. Ellen Stillwagon testified that she never kissed Danforth or called her sister, but she acknowledged that she had allowed Danforth to kiss her. and give her a sisterly greeting. She admitted that she had gotten her nephew to sign her name to a letter calling Mrs. Danforth sister, and she told her son to write and call her aunt. She claimed she did it to try to draw out the truth and find out whether Danforth was her sister or not. She could not see any of her sister's looks in her. She swore positively that Danforth was not Emily Ward. Anne Harrison, Emily's cousin that Emily would often visit, testified that she could not detect one single feature of the lost girl in Mrs. Danforth's face. However, she would not swear that she was not Emily. The lost Emily's mom, Mrs. Mary Ward, was a genteel 74-year-old lady. She took the stand and told the story of her daughter's disappearance. During her testimony, the claimant sat within 6 feet of Mrs. Ward. The two ladies did not look like there was any difference in their ages. Mr. Smiley asked, "Is this woman your daughter, Emily?" Mrs. Ward, "No, sir, she is not my daughter." When cross-examined, she said, "I'm positive this is not my daughter. I would know her." The defense brought into evidence Danforth's application for divorce from John Gray, made in 1869. In the application, she swore that she was married in 1834, 12 years before Emily left home. If she truly was married in 1834, the ages of her sons actually would make sense. Her maiden name did not appear in this official document. Neither did the name Emily or Mahala. On the third day of the trial, the mother and 6 siblings of Emily were arraigned before the jury in order of their birth. Harvey, Curtis, Ellen, Nancy, George, and Amanda. Danforth was given the place of the lost Emily, between Curtis and Ellen. All of their heads were uncovered, and the spectators sprang to their feet. All of the Wards had dark hair woven with silver threads. But Mrs. Danforth was much grayer than the others. The siblings all had sharp noses, sharp chins, high cheekbones, sallow complexions, brown eyes, and brown hair. Danforth had dark blue eyes with a greenish tinge, square chin, and cheeks sunken for the want of teeth. Time had whitened her hair, but the black hair remaining did not correspond with the brown locks of the others. Her nose, however, was peculiarly and distinctly a Ward nose. Once the defense felt like they had adequately proven that Danforth was not Emily, they attempted to show who she really was. They called James Dixon, the tailor. He said he was 63. Mrs. Danforth had lived at his house for 13 years and had told him her maiden name was Mahala Hill. He had heard her call George Hill her father and recognized Calvin Hill as her uncle and George Hill's 2 daughters as her sisters. He testified that her son, Al, died in 1863 and must have been between 43 and 44 years old. If her twins, who cooked for the captain, were alive, he thought they would be about 40 years old. He swore that she told him her first husband's name was Charles Rue Gray and that he saw letters addressed to him by that name. Upon cross-examination, the tailor began to sound mad as a hatter. He was answering questions so peculiarly that everyone in the courtroom was convinced he was not in his sound mind. An old river pilot named George Preston swore that the claimant was Mahala Hill and that he had known her son Al in 1840. The strength of his testimony was also weakened by some strange claims he made. The most interesting evidence was given by William B. Crawford, the postmaster at Salamanca for the previous 12 years. He swore that he had bought shingles from George Hill and knew his family well. He had known Mrs. Danforth as Mahala Hill in 1836 or 37, and her son Al in 1840. He knew the other daughters, Carolina, Lavisa, and Elmira, as well. He was told all of them, including Mahala, were abandoned women, and he did not believe it. Cross-examination became even more interesting. Judge McCandless asked, "Were you not indicted in Cattaraugus County for the murder of an illegitimate child begot by you upon the body of Lavisa Hill?" Postmaster Crawford: "No, sir, I was not indicted there." Judge McCandless: "Was not information made against you, charging you with putting that child out of the way?" The postmaster replied, "Complaint of some kind was made. It was about this child, but I don't recollect what it was. Lavisa ran away, and the matter never went further. I was discharged." The lawyers finished, and the case went to the jury. The jury was out 30 minutes and returned a verdict 11-1 against Mrs. Danforth. Judge McCandless, Crosby, and other lawyers for her said they were going to pursue a new trial. They were convinced that their client was the genuine Emily Ward, and their opinion was shared by many respectable citizens. They said the verdict was against the evidence, and that the testimony of Congressman Thompson and State Senator Greer would put a new face on the trial. Crosby claimed the sisters, Ellen and Nancy, boarded with one of the jurors during the trial. Since the jury was not kept together, this had a major influence on the verdict. He discovered two of George Hill's daughters were still living, one in Wheeling, West Virginia, and the other in Cattaraugus County, New York. He believes that they will verify Mrs. Danforth's story. He had hopes of discovering the real Mahala Hill. He was trying to locate a man who was a neighbor of Grandmother Hill and could remember Emily's arrival there with her uncle and could identify her. Crosby said that Harvey's hatred of George Hill was so extreme that he told Mrs. Harrison he would have acknowledged Mrs. Danforth was his sister if George Ward had not been the first to find her. Her family had been so positive in their recognition of her that he wasn't aware that they denied her until a week before the trial. 2 weeks before the trial, the other lawyer, Frank Ray, interviewed Ellen and Nancy. They both said they would not swear that Mrs. Danforth was not the lost Emily for the world. Those who believed that Mrs. Danforth was the true Emily said that she was repudiated by the mother because of the shameless life she had lived with Dixon. The mom was a stern woman and could not bear the disgrace of such an association. There were people who believed that Mrs. Danforth was Mahala Hill. They believed that George Hill had killed Emily and her uncle. Mahala substituted herself for the real Emily. Her knowledge of the murder would account for her parents' harsh treatment of her. If Danforth was Emily, then where was Mahala? But if she was Mahala, then where was Emily? The other question is, where is Emily's uncle, Sheldon? One other possible angle might be her cousin's husband, Harrison. He definitely had shown some strange interest in Emily. Emily and her uncle had stayed at their place before heading to Grandmother Ward's house, and there was never a letter from the grandmother to verify Emily's arrival there. Harrison had returned Azahel's horses back to his farm on the day that Emily and her uncle left. What do you think happened? Do you think Danforth was the lost Emily? A lot of people did. Do you think that George Hill did something to the uncle, but not Emily? I can't find where there was ever another trial, but I would love to have more of this story, the rest of the story, but I can't find it. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this story. I don't know. I don't know what I think. I really wonder if she was really Emily because this lady seems so much older. I don't know why. I just tend to think that maybe the cousin's husband had something to do with it because there was never really any confirmation of anyone else ever seeing them after that. So I guess that's why we have the confirmation that yes, they were there, but after that, we don't really know anything. So that to me seems a little bit suspicious. Other than that, I don't know. There's no confirmation that he did anything, and he probably didn't, but I don't know. It's really strange. So I believe that something happened to Emily and the uncle, and I really don't think this was Emily, but I think there's some things that this girl knew, maybe that she wasn't sharing, or maybe because of mental anguish and abuse, that maybe her memory was messed up. Maybe she thought she was Emily. I think that she probably had a hard life, but I don't know if it was Emily or not. It might have been, but she seemed like the age and things didn't seem to line up with it. But there were obviously people who thought she was. I don't know why the family changed their mind and decided that they didn't. I don't know if it was because of factual information or if it was because of a selfish purpose, maybe because of the land and the money. Share with me what you guys think in the comments below. And if you like my channel, please subscribe. If there's any cases that you would like me to look into, just let me know. I really enjoy the old ones. I guess they don't seem as sad, even though they're sad. It's people that wouldn't necessarily still be alive. So I can handle them a little bit better than some of the newer ones. But I will do newer ones as well, also. But if there is a particular case that you guys want me to cover or look into, just let me know. Thank you. Bye.